I never thought I'd be capable of dragging a man's life through hellfire and ruin. But when the person destroying my family was hiding behind a mask of control and cruelty, I knew silence wasn't an option. My name is Selene Marwood. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how I carefully unraveled it all right from the basement apartment I call home in Portland, Oregon. Before we get into it, let me know what time it is and where you're watching from in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to Brutal Revenge Stories so you never miss what happens next. My story starts quietly, almost deceptively so, in the dimly lit basement apartment beneath the house where I live with my mother and my mother's second husband, the man I call L at first glance. It looked like the typical balancing act of a law student trying to carve a future amid the chaos of life. Textbooks stacked neatly on the cluttered desk, the faint hum of a laptop processing yet another essay, and the small sounds of my mother moving slowly upstairs, her footsteps heavy with fatigue. I was determined. That was the one thing that kept me going. Born and raised here in Portland, I've always been surrounded by a kind of rough-edge practicality, the sort that comes with growing up watching people wrestle with their demons behind closed doors. But nothing prepared me for the darkness that crept into our home, masked as quiet control, wrapped in a veneer of order and routine. Growing up, my mother was my anchor and my shield. She was a kind woman, one who gave everything she had to make sure her children were safe in an uncertain world. But the man who came into her life when I was still too young to understand the difference between love and fear, L, was like a storm cloud that never quite passed. His temper was a flickering flame, sometimes barely noticeable, sometimes raging out of control, and always dangling over us like a threat no one dared to name out loud. I remember the restless nights, the tense silences broken by his sudden outbursts, words sharper than knives, hands clenched tight enough to bruise. Those were memories I buried deep because I didn't have the words then or the strength to fight back. It wasn't until years later, when cancer stole in quietly and took hold of my mother's body like a thief in the night, that I realized just how deep the traps we were caught in really were. The doctors called it ovarian cancer at first, a terrifying diagnosis on its own, but then it mutated into something even rarer and more aggressive, a connective tissue cancer that defied treatment protocols. My mother's fear was palpable, not just of the disease itself, but of the man whose control extended even over her medical decisions. L, with all his violence and venom, threatened not just our peace, but my mother's very chance of surviving. He openly resisted treatment plans, sabotaged her transportation to appointments, and controlled the finances meant to keep her alive. I knew that if I stayed silent, if I let his darkness swallow us, there would be nothing left of the family I loved and the mother who had fought so hard to keep us safe. So I resolved to stand quietly but firmly. This was my fight now. I wasn't just a law student buried in books. I was a protector. And nothing, not even the worst kind of hate, would break my resolve. This is how it all began. The hospital waiting room smelled sterile, the sharp tang of antiseptics mixing with the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. My mother sat tensely in the chair beside me, her frail hands clutching the edge of her coat, knuckles white. The calendar on the wall showed it was the third appointment since the cancer diagnosis had morphed into something worse, a rare connective tissue cancer known for its cruelty and resistance. L was nowhere to be seen at first. I thought maybe, for once, he might hold back his usual storm. But then the door swung open, slamming against the wall, and there he was, his presence cutting the quiet like a jagged shard. His face was flushed, jaw tight, eyes dark with something that wasn't just anger, it was ownership. He wasn't coming just to watch, he was there to control. The oncologist, a composed middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, greeted us with a faint, practiced smile. He glanced briefly at L, seemingly aware of the tension but professionally neutral. He started to explain the next steps in treatment, laying out chemotherapy cycles and possible clinical trials that could buy precious time for my mother. That's when L shifted in the fabric of the chair, lacing his fingers tightly as if to choke the very idea of hope from the room. "I'm not allowing this," L's voice cut through the calm like a blade. "You're not putting her through more poison. She's done." The doctor blinked, visibly taken aback. "Mr. Marwood, the treatments are the best option. We have a team monitoring her progress closely." "Without intervention, no intervention," L said, rising now, pacing in front of us like a caged animal determined to make his presence known. "She's been sick long enough. All these appointments, these bills, this nonsense, it's killing her faster than the cancer." I sat frozen, my pulse pounding against my throat. My mother's eyes flickered with terror and helplessness. Her frailty was the open wound Elle preyed upon with calculated certainty. The doctor's hands moved to his tablet, typing notes rapidly, his expression professional but concerned, no doubt noting Elle's open refusal of treatment for the medical record. Elle's stance was militant and final, as if demanding a ceasefire in a war only he recognized. His arguments weren't rational, they were weapons of control. I wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that he was gambling with my mother's life, but silence gripped me tight. I had to be smarter, more strategic. After the appointment ended abruptly, with the doctor clearly unwilling to debate further, Elle's shadow fell heavier over the coming days. It started with the small things, missing rides to the hospital, canceled appointments with no explanation. When I confronted him, his responses were sharp and designed to disarm. "She doesn't need all those needles and machines. We're just wasting time and money." The financial strangulation came next. Bank statements revealed transfers disappearing without authorization, money meant for prescriptions, for specialists, for the fragile lifeline of treatment. Elle had tightened the reins on every dollar entering the household, diverting funds, sabotaging any effort we made to pay for care or to hire help in taking care of my mother. His cruelty wasn't in wild outbursts anymore. It was slow, deliberate, suffocating. Sabotaging Uber accounts so rides were canceled or would never arrive. Blocking my calls to arrange private care. Making phone calls late at night to harass pharmacies and delay vital medications. I watched helplessly as the man who was supposed to care for my mother became the architect of her suffering. The psychological abuse bled into me as well. His cold stares, veiled threats when I tried to organize a ride or get the insurance company upgraded coverage. It was relentless, and beneath it all was that unspoken message. No one here, not my mother, not me, would escape without his permission. The part that broke something in me wasn't just the overt sabotage, it was the calculated way he framed it as looking out for the family, as if his cruelty was some kind of twisted protection. And God help anyone who called him out on it. His temper flared unpredictably, twisting conversations into minefields where one wrong word led to days of Cold War silence, or worse, resentful, pointed accusations that I was trying to ruin his family. I knew I couldn't rely on anyone else. Neither the police nor social services could interfere unless clear evidence existed. Elle remained a chameleon to the outside world, polite to neighbors, a steady provider on paper. But behind closed doors, he was a tyrant, poisoning not just my mother's health, but the very foundation of our lives. That's when I made the decision to move my mother into the basement apartment I controlled, a place where Elle's physical access would be restricted. The trade-off was difficult. It was cramped, dimly lit, and far removed from the comforts of the main house, but it became our sanctuary. The move was subtle, done in the dead of night with soft whispers, quick packing, and my mother's frail body resting on borrowed courage. It was a declaration. No longer would we be trapped by the storm he brewed upstairs. Once she was down there, I started making the space livable, scheduling transportation I personally managed, coordinating with a doctor who could make house calls, and ordering medications shipped directly to the apartment. Every detail was designed to sever the poisonous ties Elle had strangled us with, but the storm wasn't done raging. The next morning, when Elle discovered the change, his fury was volcanic. He slammed doors upstairs, shouted threats we could hear through the floorboards, and sent frantic, bitter texts that veiled ultimatums as concern. "You think you can hide from me? You're only delaying what's coming." I stayed calm, the simmering rage inside masked by quiet resolve. This was a battle for survival, and I would not be defeated by fear. As weeks bled into months, I watched him unravel in a terrifying way. His presence in the house became erratic. He vanished for days only to show up at odd hours, his eyes wild with resentment. He targeted me directly, cutting off internet and cable, changing Wi-Fi passwords, slashing the tires on my aging car parked nearby. Each act meant to intimidate, to isolate, but it all only steeled me further. I invested what little savings I had into installing security cameras around the property, making sure every angle exposed what he tried to conceal. Before activating them, I told him openly, "You're being recorded. Any attempt to interfere with my mother or me will be documented." His mocking laughter in response was a promise in itself, a crude admission of guilt. L's abusive tactics evolved into full-scale obstruction. He contacted lenders from the shadows, freezing bank accounts, withholding access to essential funds. He contacted utility companies to threaten shutoffs. He poisoned relationships with neighbors, spreading lies about me being unstable or dishonest in an effort to isolate our little refuge. Yet through every twisted maneuver, I learned more about his patterns, his arrogance, his belief that he could rewrite the rules of what justice and family meant. One evening, a month after the basement move, I arrived home to find the front yard strewn with garbage bags filled with broken things from the house, the physical remnants of a tantrum designed to send a message. Inside, the thermostat was turned to freezing, the water lines tampered with just enough to cause leaks but not fully destroy. This was psychological warfare, the slow, soul-eroding kind, but I refused to back down. I spent long nights reviewing the footage from hidden cameras, preparing for the day when every lie, every act of cruelty would be undeniable. My mother's health ebbed and flowed in this maelstrom. Some days, I would hold her trembling hand after a treatment, reassuring her that we were fighting not just the cancer, but the very man who sought to steal her life. Others, I stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to map out the next steps in this battle to protect the woman who had given me everything. The darkening storm that was L no longer hid behind polite smiles and quiet nights. He had revealed his true self fully, and it was uglier and more dangerous than I ever imagined. But I had found my own resolve, quiet and unyielding. This was war, and every move mattered. Nothing would be left standing in his wake, not his control, not his threats, not even the legacy of fear he tried to impose on my family. The air in the living room was thick with tension, so dense it felt like it might crack under the weight of everything unsaid. L lounged in his chair like a king, surveying a kingdom he thought was still his. The same smug smirk plastered across his face that always made me want to tear it off and suffocate it with silence. I stood opposite him, barely breathing, every muscle wound tight, the words I'd rehearse 1,000 times forming sharp edges behind my teeth. "This stops now," I said, voice low but steady, impossible to ignore. "Your abuse, your sabotage, it ends today. If you don't walk away, there will be consequences." He laughed, that cruel, condescending laugh that sliced through the room like glass breaking. "Consequences? You think you can threaten me? I own half this house, I control the money, and don't forget, I know what you're afraid of." Afraid? The irony was delicious. I wasn't the one trembling. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You have no legal ground to kick me out. And even if you try, I'll make sure you and your sick mother regret ever crossing me. You think law school makes you clever? I've survived this game longer than you've been alive." The room seemed to shrink, but I held my ground. He had miscalculated. That moment, that confrontation, was the spark that ignited what would become our war. I stepped closer. "You're wrong. I'm not afraid of you anymore. And I've already started taking steps you can't erase." I nodded toward the security cameras nestled in the corners of the ceiling, silent sentinels gathering every second of his abuse. "You've been recorded, all of it. Every lie, every threat, every effort to sabotage my mother's treatment." His face twitched, that imperceptible flicker before fury boils over. "You think that makes a difference? I'll shut them down." "Go ahead." I swallowed the surge of adrenaline. "I've got every hour backed up and stored in multiple places. A trail of proof you won't escape. And if you try to deny it in court, well," I let the threat hang sharp and clear. He bared his teeth, the facade splintering. "You think you can fight me with cameras and lawyers? You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know exactly who you are," I said quietly, "and I'm done letting you destroy my family." That was the moment the truce shattered clean and irreparably. In the days that followed, I set my plan in motion. I notified him formally, in writing, of the security cameras installed for our protection and my intention to use any evidence of abuse and sabotage for legal action. The tone was crystal clear, respectful but unyielding. I wanted no room to claim ignorance. His retaliation was brutal but predictable. The house turned into a battleground waged through Cold War tactics and financial manipulation. I discovered accounts being frozen without my knowledge, bills suddenly unpaid despite my attempts to cover them. L had pulled every trick in the book, abusing his joint access to accounts, submitting appeals and holds on my mother's medical insurance records, delaying approvals, all under the radar. At first, I attempted to resolve these sabotage attempts quietly, calling banks, insurance companies, utility providers. But each call ended with vague denials, unexplained delays, and more harassing phone calls from L pretending to be concerned or an official. It was a Kafkaesque maze designed to suffocate us financially and emotionally. Recognizing the size of the fight, I made a decision that would change everything. I shifted my law school focus to criminal and family law. If I was going to take down Elle, I would do so armed with knowledge and understanding, not just fear and resentment. Books, lectures, late nights poring over case files, it was a lifeline amid the chaos. Meanwhile, I placed visible cameras in key rooms and entrances, painstakingly positioning them so there was no blind spot. When Elle noticed, his fury exploded into vicious verbal assaults. He raged about privacy invasion, harassment, and claimed I was turning the house into a prison. But I stood my ground. The entire household was my mother's sanctuary, not his playground for terror. The cameras documented everything. The hostile stares when I brought my mother to appointments, the slamming doors when he found bills paid, the sabotaged rides that left us stranded in the rain, the whispered threats meant to unravel our sanity, the fights where Elle wallowed in cruelty, unmasked and vicious. At one point, Elle started involving neighbors, spreading lies that I was stealing money, exaggerating my mother's illness for sympathy, trying to take over the family fortune. I confronted him directly. "You're poisoning the people around us with your lies. What does that get you? More loneliness? More isolation? Because I'm not leaving." He sneered but said nothing. Words were weapons, yes, but so was silence in this war. Financially, I tightened the screws. I redirected what little unencumbered money we had to secure separate accounts outside joint access, half a step ahead of every effort to sabotage. I arranged for direct payments to doctors from third parties to bypass Elle's interference. He tried to retaliate by leveraging the joint ownership of the house. "You want a war?" he said. "I'll bankrupt you." He began threatening eviction notices, legal battles over ownership, vowing to contest any decisions I might make without him. I realized that to win, I needed more than evidence. I needed powerful allies. I found them, quietly bringing a family law attorney into the fold, a specialist known for taking on abusive spouses and tricky property disputes. The first consultations were grueling, gut-wrenching conversations that laid bare the chaos Elle had sown and the vulnerability my mother and I faced. But I watched as the attorney's eyes hardened, fierce and focused, the kind of fire I longed to wield. We drafted official letters to Elle, demanding he cease all interference with medical treatment, financial accounts, and the household. We filed preliminary motions to freeze his access to certain bank accounts critical for my mother's care. Each move was surgical, delivered with precision. Every document was a tick, another step in dismantling Elle's control. The tension under the same roof became electric. Elle's presence grew more erratic. He stopped hiding his contempt, openly mocking me when I passed by, sneering that my petty legal maneuvers wouldn't stop him. But behind the bravado, the cracks were showing. One afternoon, he confronted me in the kitchen, voice low and venomous. "You think you're clever, don't you? But I know your weakness, Selene, your mother, and I'll use her sickness against you every time." I met his gaze, anger boiling beneath calm. "Try it, I'm protecting her, more than you ever did or will." His laugh was a dangerous hiss, but something in his eyes wavered. The notion that I was no longer afraid, that I was fighting back with weapons he couldn't easily defeat, that unsettled him deeply. I began to realize that this battle would be fought on every front, a psychological chess match, a war of social perception, a brutal legal struggle where every move cut deeper than the last. I prepared myself for all of it. And so, as the battle lines were drawn clearly in the dust of our lives, I stepped into the ring, not with wild fury, but with cold calculation, an unshakable calm, and the fierce knowledge that I would see this through until the bitter end. Because there was no other choice. No retreat, no surrender, only victory. The moment I signed the retainer with the family law attorney, the war shifted gears. It was no longer just about surviving another day in that suffocating house, but about turning the tables decisively. The fortress I needed to build wasn't just physical, it was legal, financial, unassailable. The attorney was sharp, no nonsense, and immediately grasped the extent of Elle's manipulation and abuse. She laid out the strategic moves like a seasoned general preparing for siege. Asset freezes, protective orders, and litigation designed to corner Elle until he had nowhere left to hide. I soaked in every word, every plan, feeling a rush of empowerment mingle with the exhaustion that never quite left me. First on the agenda was the property. The house was jointly owned, a leverage point Elle clung to like a lifeline. My mother's health and security needed to be guaranteed, no matter what games he played. The attorney filed motions to freeze his access to the joint accounts tied to the property and to prevent any unilateral decisions like selling or mortgaging. It was a legal steel cage designed to trap his spiteful ambitions. When the court papers arrived at the house, L's response was as predictable as it was infuriating. He refused to engage, refusing every overture with venomous silence, convinced his absence could unravel the process. What he didn't realize was that silence was no longer his ally, it was his cage. Then came the offer. Somehow, through back channels, a proposal wrapped in spite rather than resolution landed on my attorney's desk. L, infuriated by the encroachment on his dominion, was prepared to accept my offer to buy out his 50% share of the house on his terms. He demanded $250,000, an arbitrary figure far beyond what he deserved, designed to push me to the brink. I was pre-approved for a loan, ready to protect my mother's sanctuary, but the price was a war tactic, a trap of financial intimidation. I responded coolly, negotiating, seeing through the venom embedded in his demands. I wasn't here to line his pockets out of spite. His stubbornness screamed that he preferred to burn the house down than to hand over control quietly. Months dragged on in this fragile, bitter stalemate. L's refusal shattered the last remnants of truce. Eviction notices, legal summons, more court filings, they flowed relentlessly like an emotional and financial assault. But I was prepared. I arranged security upgrades, reinforced locks on all exterior doors, and installed state-of-the-art surveillance systems connected remotely to my phone and laptop. Every step I took made it harder for L to sneak back into our lives, to threaten the fragile peace we'd carved out. In parallel, the attorney filed for a restraining order. The grounds were solid: documented abuse, verified sabotage, interference with medical treatment. The judge granted it without hesitation. L was ordered to stay away from the property and all contact with my mother and me. I knew this was just paper armor, that the real battle would be fought day by day, but it was a fortress wall nonetheless. The court hearings were brutal. L's presence, or lack of it, spoke volumes. He ignored summons, dismissed subpoenas, betting on the system's patience to run out. But my attorney was relentless, serving every motion meticulously, piling evidence layer upon layer. The recorded footage, the medical notes with explicit mentions of his outbursts, his financial sabotage, it all painted a portrait too damning to ignore. While the legal war raged, L turned to underhanded tactics. Flyers appeared in the neighborhood, slandering my mother and me with cruel lies designed to erode our social support. Anonymous calls to employers painted me as unstable, a liar trying to manipulate the system. For a moment, I felt the sting of isolation and doubt creeping in. But then I remembered who I was fighting for. I channeled every frustration into action, countering his smears with quiet dignity and the undeniable truth of justice unfolding in the courtroom. The crushing blow came when the court finally awarded sole possession of the home to my mother, accompanied by the freezing of L's assets related to the property and issuance of a strict eviction order. The judge's words weighed heavy in the air, a recognition of the abuse, a clear condemnation of his actions. To see that gavel fall was to hear the sound of boundaries redrawn, lines etched deeply in stone. Days before L was to be evicted, I prepared meticulously. The locks were changed, alarm systems fully armed, neighbors informed and watching. When he showed, once, twice, hoping to intimidate, it was met with calm authority and the quiet presence of law enforcement waiting patiently behind the walls. With his eviction, a chapter closed but did not end. The house, once a battlefield, became our fortress. I began renovations, not just to restore walls battered by neglect and wrath, but to build a sanctuary worthy of my mother's courage and the countless battles fought within. Each fresh coat of paint, each repaired fixture felt like reclaiming a piece of our dignity. Financially, I tightened the fortress with vigilance. Negotiations continued over the buyout price, his arrogance clashing with my resolve. I refused to overpay. Every cent was a statement, a shove back against greed and cruelty. The court set a fair market value far below his inflated demand, forcing him to accept terms or yield. Throughout this, I kept my mother at the center, enrolling her in support programs, coordinating care meticulously. Safe transportation to her treatments was no longer a battlefield riddled with L's sabotage. Finally, for the first time in ages, the word safe carried real weight in our lives. Securing the fortress wasn't merely about bricks and legal papers. It was about reclaiming power, rewriting a narrative once dominated by fear and control. Every step was calculated and brutal in its own way, designed to dismantle Elle's twisted reign piece by piece until nothing remained. The house was no longer just a home. It was a monument to survival, resistance, and the relentless pursuit of justice. And I stood ready to defend it, not just with law, but with every ounce of unyielding will I possessed. The courthouse corridor smelled of stale coffee and desperation, the kind of place where lives unraveled and twisted up in the tangle of legal jargon and cold rules. I didn't flinch stepping into that arena. Every tense heartbeat felt like another weapon loaded in my arsenal. Elle's name was on the docket again, but the man himself, nowhere to be found. His arrogance blinded him to the consequences of skipping court appearances, assuming his silence would dissolve the case like smoke. He didn't know that silence, in this battle, was a confession. My attorney and I sat side by side at the long table, piles of folders and digital records spread before us. The full extent of his manipulations was laid bare. Financial documents showing missing funds, timestamps on videos capturing his volatile outbursts, detailed logs of his sabotage and interference with my mother's care. This wasn't just theory anymore, it was evidence carved in stone. The judge entered sharply, a stern woman whose gaze cut through the usual courtroom theater. She called the case and noted Elle's absence with quiet disapproval. The first order was clear. A default judgment could be entered if he failed to appear again. That was my opening. We presented the video footage first. The grainy, undeniable proof of Elle's distorted temper, the way his words grated like acid, the moments he blocked rides or stormed through appointments with calculated malice. The judge watched, face unreadable, but the weight of those hours pinned Elle like an insect on display. Next came the financial threads, a sinister web of frozen accounts, withheld payments, and interference. I laid out the timeline, each attempt Elle made to choke my mother's treatment funds, and how we fought back. The judge nodded as the scale tipped. But it wasn't just the law that swung in my favor, it was the perception of morality, too. Public sentiment mattered, and our evidence painted Elle not just as a defiant absentee, but as a manipulative abuser bent on destruction. The courtroom was no stranger to theatrics. When Elle finally did appear, late, disheveled, and sputtering excuses, it didn't sway the tide. His attempts to dismiss the evidence as fabricated or exaggerated faltered before the wall of proof. He couldn't explain away the time-stamped videos or the bank transactions that didn't align with innocent mistakes. Biting legal responses by my attorney cornered him further. Your Honor, this is not an ordinary property dispute. This is a case of documented abuse, interference with medical treatment, and financial sabotage. The judge fixed Elle with an icy glare. Mr. Marwood, your conduct has endangered the well-being of your spouse and obstructed the lawful management of shared property. This court will not tolerate such behavior. You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises immediately, and all your assets related to this case will be frozen pending further proceedings. Elle's face twisted in rage, but the courtroom held. His bravado cracked as he realized the depth of his isolation. Outside the courtroom, a quiet storm brewed. News of the case's developments began to leak, a calculated move by my attorney to let community pressure and social accountability chip away at Elle's ability to manipulate behind closed doors. Neighbors, once unsure, now voiced concern. Friends whispered caution. And in the halls of Elle's business, loyalty wavered. Yet, Elle fought on. He employed lawyers of his own, aggressive and slick, filing motions to dismiss evidence, dragging out proceedings with mountains of paperwork and delaying tactics. But every move met our strategy, solid, relentless, unyielding. As the months wore on, I became intimately familiar with the language of the law, not just from textbooks but in real, brutal practice. Each hearing was a chess match, each document a strike. I was no longer just a student, I was a warrior sharpening her weapons with every ruling, every deposition. During one tense hearing, my lawyer revealed something that felt like a turning point, the hidden audio recording from the hospital appointment where Elle openly refused his wife's treatment in front of the staff. It wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was a testament. The judge watched it silently, the room heavy with unspoken judgment. That day, the judge issued a restraining order, not just from the home, but also forbidding any contact with my mother. The legal noose tightened, and Elle's options dwindled. Socially, Elle's world was unraveling. The neighbors who once nodded politely began avoiding him outright. The small business he owned faced boycotts fueled by whispers of his cruelty. Whispers I had once feared now became whispers of warning to others. Financially, the freezes strangled his assets. Credit cards were suspended, accounts locked. His attempts to sneak funds or tug on financial threads behind the scenes were caught quickly by the forensic accountant my lawyer brought in. I found an unexpected ally in the most unlikely place, Elle's own lender, who grew wary of the constant legal bluster around Elle's debts. They began cutting off lines of credit, demanding full settlements that Elle simply could not produce. At home, every message Elle tried to send, veiled threats, demands, insults, was met with silence backed by legal protections. My mother's care stabilized under new arrangements I orchestrated, safe from his interference. But the fight wasn't over. Elle's desperation birthed new schemes, attempting to question my mental health to discredit me, filing counterclaims accusing me of fraud, trying to stall probate. His lawyers wove elaborate stories designed to bog down the courts. I met every challenge with fierce determination, turning every smear into a documented lie, every accusation into a legal trap. My growing knowledge of family and criminal law became my shield and sword. Then came the moment when the court finally handed down a critical ruling: sole possession of the home to my mother, the freezing of Elle's assets related to the property, and an eviction order. The ruling was clear and scathing, a mirror held up to his cruelty and sabotage. Watching the court marshal our evidence and testimony into justice was a bittersweet victory. It meant months of sleepless nights, emotional exhaustion, and battle, but it also meant the fortress was no longer just a dream. With Elle's eviction looming, I prepared the household and community for the change. Neighborhood watch programs were activated, local law enforcement was briefed, and a renewed sense of safety began to bloom. The courtroom victories echoed beyond legal walls. Elle's reputation crumbled under the weight of truth. His social standing plummeted as word spread of his abuse and obstruction. Each step forward dismantled the stronghold Elle had built on fear and silence. The alliances I forged, with attorneys, neighbors, support networks, became the scaffolding that kept us upright. On the day Elle was finally ordered to leave, I stood firm, not with hatred burning in my chest, but with an unshakable calm and quiet rage that justice had been delivered. The battle lines had been drawn in law, in trust, and in the soil beneath our home. Our fight was brutal, agonizing, but every ounce of pain forged the path toward liberation. And in that courtroom, as the gavel fell, I knew the war was far from over. But for the first time, victory felt possible. The morning light filtered softly through the narrow basement window as I sat across from my mother, her frail hands folded in her lap. For the first time in months, there was a trace of calm in her eyes, an ember of hope flickering amid the darkness that had long consumed our lives. After a relentless legal battle and the chaos that followed, something was finally shifting. The Government Disability Support Program had approved her application earlier that week, a result I had fought tooth and nail for. It was more than just financial aid. It was a lifeline restoring dignity and access to care. With the approval came reliable transportation to her treatments, coordinated nursing support, and reassurance that we could finally depend on consistent medical attention unhampered by Elle's sabotage. A steady rhythm emerged, appointments scheduled and kept, medications delivered on time, bills paid without the shadow of interception. The basement apartment, once a refuge from the storm, slowly transformed into a haven of healing. Each small victory drew the fog of despair further away. But peace was fragile. Elle's spite was relentless. He refused to acknowledge the court's rulings, dodging service of divorce papers and financial resolutions. Instead, he waged a quiet war of attrition, delaying proceedings through endless motions and legal filibustering. The courts were swamped, and his tactics bought him time to cling, desperately, to a semblance of control. Despite the courtroom's clear orders, Elle maintained his defiance, drumming up excuses to stall, to claim technicalities, to manipulate loopholes. His pride, more than anything, drove a wedge between closure and chaos. This man, who had once tried to suffocate my mother's treatment, now forced us to endure months of uncertainty for the simple pleasure of torment. Amid the sluggish dance of the court system, my mother's courage shone brightest. One morning, reclined in her wheelchair beside me, she made a decision that surprised even me. She moved to change the tenancy terms on the house from joint tenants to tenants in common. It was a quiet but powerful move, a legal shield ensuring that when her time came, the house would pass directly to me, safeguarding our sanctuary from any clawback or claim by Elle. I sat with her as she signed the paperwork, the weight of the moment pressing down, but also offering a bittersweet relief. It was her act of defiance, her final embrace of hope amid the shadows. Yet the days were not without their thorns. Elle's presence lingered like a foul odor. Despite eviction orders and frozen assets, he found ways to harass, sending threatening letters, anonymous tips to social workers questioning our stability, and clear insinuations that he would wait out my mother's life to reclaim everything. His cruelty found new forms, psychological harassment replacing physical intimidation. But we had learned to endure, to push back not with brute force but with strategy and resilience. Every letter he sent was met with legal counters, every accusation investigated and disproven. The community we once feared turning against us had become a subtle shield. Neighbors now opened doors with nods of support and quiet offers to help. The flicker of hope was fragile, yet it grew steadily. My mother's treatments began showing small signs of effectiveness, her energy returning in soft waves, her voice less faint, her laughter rare but genuine. Those moments were treasures, glimmers of light breaking through years of darkness. I restructured our lives around these victories, balancing the relentless court battles with the tenderness of caregiving. Mornings were filled with medication schedules and comforting words, evenings with whispered memories of a better past and dreams of an even better future. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling hospital visit, my mother grasped my hand tightly. "No matter what comes," she whispered, "we've built something they can't take away." I squeezed back, the truth of her words anchoring me through the storm yet to come. We controlled what we could: the house, the care, the legal rights. And though Elle's shadow stretched long, the fortress around us grew stronger with every brick laid, legal battles won, social networks forged, and a mother's unwavering love. That flicker of hope in the darkness was more than a moment, it was a promise, one I was determined to keep. The weight of the world settled heavily on my shoulders the moment I became my mother's primary nurse, protector, and anchor. Every day was a labyrinth of decisions, whispers of pain, and silent battles fought in the small hours when the house was dark and her breathing shallow beside me. Her illness had morphed from a distant shadow to an unrelenting presence, and I was trapped in its grip, balancing the brutal demands of caregiving with the electric tension of a legal war raging just beyond our walls. Mornings began before dawn, the pale light barely seeping through the curtains as I checked her vitals, administered medications, and prepared meals crafted to nourish a body silently waging war against itself. Her skin grew thinner by the day, frail and translucent, the tiny bruises and scars a cruel testament to the disease and the years of abuse that had weakened her. Sometimes, she would look up at me, eyes glistening with tears or exhaustion, and whisper, "Thank you for not letting him win." Those moments broke me, sharpened my resolve, and fueled the fire that would carry me through nights spent sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand as machines beeped softly in the background. Her pain was a constant, unyielding companion, but so was her courage, a flickering flame I refused to let extinguish. As her physical needs escalated, so did the psychological warfare that Elle orchestrated from the shadows. Despite court orders and restraining conditions, his bitterness twisted into chilling declarations heard through the grapevine and recorded in snippets of intercepted messages. He vowed to wait out my mother, to reclaim everything only after she had passed, a sinister watchman lurking beyond our fragile sanctuary. I confronted those threats with calculated defiance. Every vile text, every bitter voicemail was logged and forwarded to my attorney. Each documented attack became another brick in the wall we were building against him. But none of that prepared me for the courtroom exchanges where his rage materialized in words sharper than knives. One hearing remains seared into my memory, a cold room packed with legal professionals and a judge whose expression oscillated between disbelief and restrained anger. Elle stood defiant, his gaze steely, voice dripping with venom as he declared he would wait for her to die before relinquishing control. The room fell silent, the judge's eyes widening in shock. It was a moment where his true nature was laid bare for all to see, undoing years of manipulations and false fronts. That declaration did more than horrify us. It galvanized a legal and emotional victory I had fought for. The judge's reprimand was swift, issuing further protective orders and reinforcing the court's stance against his ongoing defiance. For once, the law spoke with clarity and force, delivering a blow that echoed beyond the courtroom walls. Yet, as the legal battles intensified, the burden at home grew heavier. I became not just a daughter or a student, but a nurse, administrator, counselor, and sole source of hope. The lines between these roles blurred, and exhaustion became a constant companion. Sleep was scarce, punctuated by the sounds of my mother's labored breathing or the urgent need to adjust her position to ease pressure sores. I learned to read her subtle cues, the twitch of an eyebrow or the faintest wince, telling me when pain was rising, when fear took hold. Financial strain gnawed at the edges of our lives. Medical equipment, specialized care, and the rising cost of medications stretched every dollar. The court battles drained resources and time, but I refused to let that chip away at her care. I juggled hospital bills, insurance claims, and legal fees, navigating complex systems with fierce determination. Every dollar saved was a small victory, every payment made on time a lifeline thrown against the tide of chaos. The emotional weight was perhaps the heaviest. Watching the woman who had once been my invincible mother fade into fragility was a slow unraveling of not just her body, but a shared history of dreams and memories. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and plans, became quiet exchanges punctuated by moments of pain and reflection. I held her hand during flashbacks of the abuse, offering comfort when words failed, anchoring her when despair threatened to consume us both. In the solitude of late nights, the psychological toll pressed down with brutal force. PTSD clawed at my mind, nightmares of past violence, moments of helplessness, and the relentless replaying of legal showdowns and hospital crises. But surrender was not an option. I took solace in small routines, a gentle touch, a shared song, the quiet reassurance of presence. These became acts of resistance against the chaos. Isolation was another enemy. Friends drifted away, unable to navigate the complexity and heaviness of my life. Yet, there were also unexpected pillars of support: medical professionals who saw beyond paperwork to the human story, neighbors who checked in with quiet smiles, and online communities of caregivers sharing guidance and empathy. I built a fragile network, each connection a thread weaving strength into the fabric of our daily struggle. Throughout it all, the legal battle simmered beneath the surface. Elle's continued defiance seeped into our lives, threatening to unravel progress and shatter the sanctuary I fought to create. Court dates loomed like specters, each hearing a battleground where my mother's dignity, our home, and our future were contested anew. It was a relentless siege, one that tested my limits and sharpened my resolve. Amid this maelstrom, I found moments of profound clarity. Every act of care, every legal maneuver was a tribute to my mother's strength and our unbreakable bond. I transformed grief into action, pain into purpose. This was more than survival. It was a reclamation of life and justice in the face of darkness. The caregiver's burden was crushing, yes, but it was also a mantle of fierce love and unyielding defiance. And in that crucible, we forged a legacy of strength that would outlast the storms raging around us. The room was oppressively silent except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. I sat rigid beside her bed, holding her trembling hand as if sheer force of will could keep her tethered to this world. The cancer had tightened its grip over the months, a merciless predator that no court order or legal victory could slow. But this moment was anything but controlled. It was raw, brutal, and absolute. The monitor's steady beep became a cruel metronome, marking the inevitable countdown. Her breathing became shallow, and when her eyes fluttered open for one final time, they searched for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe solace. The weight of years, the abuse, the battles, the love pressed between us in that flickering instant. "Selene," she whispered, voice fragile but determined. I choked back the flood of despair, forcing words I barely believed. "I'm here, I won't leave you." And then the flicker went out. The monitor flatlined, and the room filled with a deafening silence that shattered every breath I'd been holding. Her death wasn't just an end, it was a seismic fracture ripping through my world. The woman who had been my anchor, my fiercest protector, my quiet sanctuary was gone. And with her, a part of me shattered, dragged into a dark vortex of grief and anger that had no mercy. I sank into the crushing solitude, the nights haunted by the ghostly echo of her last moments, the suffocating void where her warmth had been. The legal battles, once a source of hope and defense, now twisted into a relentless torment. The fight to protect her had extended into a bitter war with Elle, a war that felt increasingly cruel in light of this loss. Almost immediately, the consequences struck in ways I hadn't anticipated. Grief consumed my every waking moment, dulling the edge of my focus, unsettling the fragile balance I'd fought to establish. Every reminder of her, her favorite chair, the photos on the wall, her scent lingering faintly in the curtains, drove sharp pangs of loss that threatened to undo me. Sleep became a battleground where nightmares dragged me back to the unrelenting confrontations, the hospital corridors, and Elle's toxic presence. My mind spiraled into what I later learned was PTSD, a relentless shadow war waged inside me, where memories became weapons I could neither drop nor wield with control. Worse, Elle vanished like a ghost. One day, he simply disappeared, no forwarding address, no phone calls, no court appearances. It was an elusive retreat, a coward's escape designed to throw obstacles in my path and deny me the justice I sought. Legal summons went unanswered. His lawyer stopped returning calls. He had left the country illegally, taunting the courts and me with his absence. This flight complicated everything. Without his presence, direct legal action stalled. The threat of accountability tangled in jurisdictional limbo as we scrambled to locate him across borders. His disappearance felt like a slap, an insult layered atop years of abuse and loss. I mobilized every resource at my disposal. My attorney and I worked with international agencies, private investigators, and diplomatic contacts. Each lead was a fragile flicker in a vast darkness, every successful attempt at tracing him a momentary victory against the growing shadows. Yet, despite the crushing despair, each step forward became a seed of defiance. I refused to let his vanishing erase years of evidence, suffering, and truth. The medical notes recording his violent outburst, the video footage capturing his sabotage, the court transcripts revealing his malice, they were my weapons now. At times, the weight threatened to break me completely. The loneliness of nights spent staring at empty walls, the endless paperwork, the exhaustion battling grief, it all tested the limits of my endurance. But beneath the sorrow, something hardened, a resolve forged in fire. I channeled the rage and heartbreak into action. Probate proceedings to secure my mother's estate became a battlefield where every document mattered. Every deadline was a victory. The house, the last tangible connection to her, was no longer just a property. It was a symbol of survival, a fortress built on memory and resistance. Navigating probate without Elle's cooperation was a delicate dance. His absence created legal voids, but also potential traps. I sifted through tangled financial webs and complex legal frameworks, fighting to ensure his claims could not resurrect like specters to haunt the future I was building. Throughout it all, I faced the stark reality that the battle for justice extended beyond the courtroom. Social networks fractured under the weight of scandal and loss. Friends and family struggled to understand the labyrinthine pain I bore. Many distanced themselves, unable to face the dark truth or the lengthy war I continued to wage. But there were glimmers of support too. Trusted friends who held me through the darkest nights, legal allies who championed the cause with fierce determination, and small communities of survivors who shared stories that mirrored my own. They became the threads weaving hope through the tattered fabric of my days. In moments of quiet, I would return to the medical notes and the irrefutable evidence of Elle's outburst at the hospital, the documented moment when his cruelty was laid bare under the clinical gaze of professionals. That record became more than proof. It was a testament to the abuse that had shadowed my mother's final months and fueled the relentless legal crusade that followed. The courtroom became both sanctuary and battlefield. Even as months turned to years, hearings continued to echo with the reverberations of his defiance and my unyielding pursuit. Contempt orders were filed, charges pursued, and the shadow of accountability stretched thin but never broke entirely. Yet the absence of closure weighed heavily. The nagging sense that, despite all I had done, full justice remained tantalizingly out of reach. Elle's flight was a cruel game, a challenge to the justice system and to my own endurance. But I refused to yield. Each dawn broke with the grim determination to gather the shattered pieces: probate filings, court motions, international warrants, and the fragile fragments of healing that lay hidden beneath the sorrow. The house, once a battleground, was slowly becoming a monument to my mother's legacy, a fortress of memory and strength rising from the ruins. The shadows of loss enveloped me, relentless and unyielding. Yet within that darkness, a stubborn light burned, a flame of resolve sharpened by grief and fueled by the promise that neither Elle's cruelty nor his cowardice would erase what we had fought so hard to protect. My days became a relentless grind of legal filings, phone calls, and paperwork, each jagged piece painstakingly placed into the growing mosaic of justice. The probate process stretched endlessly before me, a bureaucratic labyrinth where every misstep could be seized upon by lurking vultures. Elle's absence had left a hollow space, a gap in the proceedings that was both a curse and an opportunity. Without his direct interference, I could push forward, but I couldn't afford complacency. The shadows of his claims haunted every form, every signature. I sat amidst piles of documents in the dim light of my small apartment, cross-referencing wills, deeds, and medical records with obsessive precision. Each page told part of the story: the hospital notes that documented Elle's public outburst, the security camera footage that laid bare his sabotage, bank statements showing diverted funds intended for my mother's care. These weren't just papers, they were weapons in a battle for truth and retribution. Every legal motion I drafted was an act of resistance. I fought to secure sole ownership of the house, the last physical connection to my mother's memory and our sanctuary against Elle's cruelty. The court needed to see more than grief. It needed to see a fortress built on indisputable evidence. Late one night, I pored over the transcripts from a hospital meeting where Elle openly defied doctors, refusing treatment for my mother. The doctor's notes were meticulous, the language clinical but damning. That moment, etched in ink and digital timestamps, became the keystone of my case, the undeniable proof that Elle's abuse had directly endangered my mother's life. But the fight wasn't confined to paperwork. I navigated a minefield of emotion, exhaustion, and trauma. The weight of loss and the grind of justice bore down relentlessly, sometimes threatening to break me. Yet every time despair clawed at my throat, I reminded myself who I was fighting for and what I refused to lose. Socially, the fallout rippled outward. Friends and family, once tentative or absent, began to recognize the gravity of what I confronted. Some offered quiet alliances, occasional phone calls, meals left at the door whispered words of encouragement. Their support was a fragile thread holding me upright in the storm. At the same time, whispers of Elle's actions spread through the neighborhood and beyond. The truth of his abuse and sabotage became a quiet but growing echo in the community, chipping away at the carefully constructed facades he once hid behind. His reputation, once shielded by silence and fear, cracked under the weight of exposure. Financially, the probate proceedings revealed complex layers of deceit. Hidden debts Elle had accrued, unauthorized withdrawals, and attempts to claim assets meant to support my mother's care. My attorney and I methodically dismantled these claims, presenting meticulous records and counterarguments that left no room for ambiguity. One day, I cross-checked an old bank statement and noticed a suspicious transfer timed just days after a canceled medical appointment. That line, innocuous to most, was a smoking gun, proof of the sabotage that had nearly cost my mother her life. I forwarded the evidence to our forensic accountant, who prepared a detailed report exposing Elle's financial sabotage in brutal clarity. Armed with this, we returned to court, and the resistance hardened. But I was ready. Every move Elle made was met with a calculated response, a legal countermeasure that chipped away at his standing and power. The house, once his domain, became increasingly firmly under my control. Emotionally, the battle was a jagged terrain. Grief lingered like a shadow, but so did resolve. I wasn't just gathering documents, I was reclaiming the fragments of a life stolen from us. Each victory in court felt like a step toward closure, a restoration of dignity stolen by Elle's cruelty. Amid the chaos, I found moments of clarity. The house, the estate, the legal victories, they were more than trophies. They were the architecture of survival, the bones of a fortress built to honor my mother's legacy and shield us from further harm. The process was brutal, an exhausting, soul-crushing grind that exposed every scar and tested every boundary, but it was mine to own. And with every form submitted, every hearing attended, I edged closer to a reckoning that would not just settle debts, but shatter the foundation Elle had built on manipulation and fear. This was no longer just about property or money. It was about justice, memory, and unyielding strength. It was about gathering every last piece and forging them into a future where abuse could not thrive, where silence was replaced by voice, and where survival was the ultimate revenge. The moment my mother passed, I thought the battles would ease, that the way of legal and emotional warfare might finally recede. But Elle, ever the spiteful ghost in our lives, even beyond the grave, refused to relinquish his grip. The feud, cold and calculated, stretched far beyond the realm of grief and closure. It became a ruthless game of control, ego, and financial domination. Documents began arriving, pleadings, motions, and claims so brazen their audacity shook me. Elle, though absent physically and geographically, was fighting as if my mother's death was just another move on his twisted chessboard. He challenged every asset, every dollar, every scrap of equity tied to the home and estate, using delays and technicalities as weapons. He tried to assert claims over debts my mother had never accrued, debts he himself was responsible for, but which he attempted to throw upon her name or mine. With the cunning of a vulture circling a carcass, he dredged up old bills, disputed property valuations, and skewed appraisals meant to devalue our standing. His goal was clear: to drag me into a legal quicksand so deep I'd never fully escape. I refused to let him define the end of this story. Harnessing all I had learned through every grueling court session and brutal negotiation, I turned the tables. Each of his attempts to inflate debts was methodically dismantled by my attorney and the forensic accountants we'd hired. We scrutinized every figure, every contract, every ledger he tried to weaponize. His fictional debts fell one by one, shredded by cold, unassailable evidence showing they were fraudulent or wholly misplaced. Then, there were the renovations I had personally financed on the house, upgrades to ensure the property was secure, livable, and honored my mother's memory. Elle demanded that the courts reappraise the property's value considering the renovations, hoping to increase the amount he claimed was owed to him, a manipulative tactic to siphon funds from me under the guise of fairness. Instead, I refused. I held my ground, arguing the upgrades were necessary repairs and improvements, essential for preserving the home's value, not for inflating equity for his benefit. The court accepted this argument, refusing any reappraisal that would grant him financial advantage. My firm refusal was a crucial blow, signaling I would not bend to his spiteful whims. The financial sparring continued with cold precision. I worked alongside legal experts to negotiate offsets, deducting legally justifiable debts Elle owed me, from missing payments during his years of sabotage to expenses I bore alone to keep the household afloat. Each offset reduced his claims further, tightening the noose. But the real war was psychological. Elle's legal maneuvers were thinly veiled weapons of spite, designed to bleed me emotionally as well as financially. Every court date summoned memories of abuse, every filing felt like reopening old wounds. He sought to make me doubt, to exhaust me until I faltered. Yet beneath the fatigue, an unshakable clarity took root. I was no longer the frightened daughter trying to protect her mother. I was a formidable opponent, versed in law and strategy, maneuvering with ruthless intelligence. My mother's memory was a shield and a sword. In a final cruel twist, Elle's claims extended beyond property. He attempted to reopen disputes over family debts, pension claims, even personal effects, igniting new courts battles that threatened to drain resources and time. But I anticipated these moves, preemptively filing motions that blocked frivolous claims and forced swift dismissals. Behind the scenes, I set up contingencies, collateral seizures, estate claims, mechanisms to prevent any posthumous tampering by Elle. My attorney helped draft airtight agreements ensuring that, should Elle ever try to challenge matters from afar, or even after death, his impact would be legally neutered. Throughout this grueling process, the court became more than a venue. It was a battleground where my mother's legacy clashed with Elle's relentless spite. And though no judgment could bring her back, each ruling that favored us chipped away at his dominion. What began as a bitter personal feud evolved into a comprehensive legal and financial dismantling of his control. The man who once sought to destroy my family found every attempt at reclaiming power gradually and inevitably stripped from him. The house, once a symbol of division and torment, stood now as a fortress, legally unassailable and tied irrevocably to my mother's, and now my name. Each victory, small or large, was a flicker of justice in a war that had already taken too much. The feud beyond the grave was brutal, a war waged not in flesh but in wills and spreadsheets, marked by tireless hours of legal fighting and emotional endurance. Yet with every piece I gathered, every claim I refuted, I built a legacy of strength and survival far beyond anything Elle could ever understand or touch. In the silence following court victories, I felt the profound weight of those battles, not just as legal triumphs, but as the reclaiming of my family's future from the clutches of bitterness and abuse. This was the revenge no one expected, a calculated, unyielding fight to protect, preserve, and prevail. The moment Elle vanished, the world shifted beneath my feet, an empty space where justice should have taken root now stretched into a shadowy void. His disappearance was calculated, an evasive maneuver to silence accountability and escape the consequences he so desperately feared. But I refused to be left chasing a ghost. I assembled a team, trusted friends skilled in digital detective work, relentless in their pursuit of the truth. We scavenged every fragment of data, every digital footprint Elle might have left behind. His emails, social media accounts, phone records, all analyzed with painstaking care. It was a manhunt in the shadows, conducted in whispers, late-night calls, and encrypted messages. Every lead was a thread, and I pulled them, weaving a map of his possible routes and hideouts. Initial traces placed him crossing the border illegally, slipping through checkpoints with a practiced ease that spoke to years of evasion. Mexico became the heart of the search, a sprawling refuge for those who wished to disappear. I coordinated with my lawyer, who liaised with authorities and border officials, feeding them the information our digital net caught. International cooperation was slow, mired in bureaucracy and jurisdictional headaches, but it was a start. Elle's breach of bail and court orders was no longer a domestic issue, it was a transnational crime. We followed bank transactions, suspiciously small cash deposits, and transfers at odd hours, each a breadcrumb leading further away, but never far enough. I talked to former acquaintances, old contacts of L.S. who hinted at his networks and safe houses. They painted a picture of a man splintered from reality, yet clinging to scraps of power through shadowy channels. Each revelation fueled both hope and frustration. The distance between us grew, but so did my resolve. If L thought he could escape justice by crossing borders and hiding behind anonymity, he underestimated me. Late nights were spent poring over satellite imagery, cross-referencing addresses with known associates, scanning for any sign of life or movement that could betray his location. I studied photographs, transaction records, and even social platforms used by expatriate communities, looking for anomalies, for whispers of his presence. My friends and I set up alerts for any public appearance or mention of someone matching L's profile. Forums and regional news were scoured relentlessly. It was a digital hunt with no mercy, each notification a pulse of adrenaline. We dealt with false leads, dead ends, and uncooperative bureaucracies. Often, I felt the gnawing weight of exhaustion and futility pressing against my hope, but surrender was not an option, not after everything we had been through. My attorney pressed for legal actions, filing violations for breach of bail and evasion of summons, intensifying the pressure through the courts. International warrants were sought, and the case gained traction in unexpected corners. Every day, the shadow of L's absence was a battlefield, an invisible war waged through technology and tenacity. Through encrypted messaging apps, my team communicated securely, sharing findings and strategizing next moves. I balanced the raw ache of loss with the cold necessity of this pursuit. We uncovered his network of contacts who assisted him in avoiding detection, individuals who trafficked in shadows and silence. I watched as their carefully constructed facades began to crumble, one connection at a time. Socially, rumors of the manhunt spread through our community. His name became synonymous with cowardice and disgrace, the man who fled instead of facing justice. Allies emerged, once distant, now determined to see the truth prevail. The narrative flipped from his control to his defeat. Financially, I coordinated with banks and financial institutions to flag any activity tied to his attempts to launder money or access funds were thwarted by these preemptive strikes. The flow of illicit resources was constricted, cutting off the lifelines he depended upon to stay hidden. I monitored every court docket, every legal filing connected to his case, preparing for the day authorities would finally apprehend him. That day would not be a moment of mercy, but of reckoning. Amid this relentless pursuit, I confronted the reality that the fight extended beyond legal and financial realms. It was psychological too. Tracking a man who once controlled us through fear now required dismantling the very network that sheltered him. The manhunt was a crucible, as grueling and unforgiving as the years of abuse I'd endured. But with every lead followed, every name uncovered, every transaction stopped, I carved a path out of darkness. This was more than retrieval, it was reclamation. I owed my mother that much, the promise that the man who destroyed so much would not escape unscathed. His flight was no victory, it was the start of a new phase in a war I would see through to the bitter end. The courtroom waited, hushed and expectant, like a battlefield about to declare its victor. The long, grinding siege against El had brought us here, to the moment when all the evidence, all the tenacity, and every shred of will I'd mustered would be judged, not just by the law, but by the unyielding scale of justice. The judge's gavel struck the wood with a finality that echoed through the room. The court declared El's claims abandoned. His attempts to claw back into the property, to stake any further claim over my mother's estate, were dismissed outright. The resounding ruling stripped him of any legal rights he had held, sealing the fortress around what was rightfully ours. I sat rigid, the weight of relief and vindication crashing over me like a tidal wave. The house that had been our battleground, our refuge, was now firmly in my name. No longer could El's shadow darken these walls, but the ruling was only the architecture of victory. The foundation needed reinforcement. Working with my attorney, I finalized agreements to honor the original buyout value, an amount carefully negotiated to reflect fairness, not greed, and crucially, to factor in the debts El owed due to his years of sabotage and failure to fulfill his responsibilities. Every dollar he tried to hide, every penny he refused to pay, was accounted for and deducted. This wasn't charity on my side, it was justice meticulously exacted. The process was painstaking, negotiations filled with veiled threats and last-ditch attempts from El's fading front. But the court stood firm, every motion reinforcing the ironclad control I now wielded over the estate and assets. Physically, I embarked on restoring the house, not out of necessity, but as a declaration. Each repair, each renovation was a brick laid against the pain and chaos of the past. Fresh coats of paint wiped away the scars of neglect. Floors reclaimed their shine. Rooms once echoing with tension now breathed calm and purpose. I poured my savings and every small windfall into transforming the space into a tribute, a place where memories weren't poisoned by fear and where my mother's strength could live on. It was rebirth forged from ruin. Financial strategies extended beyond the house. My attorney and I worked to tighten controls over remaining assets connected to El mechanisms were put in place to intercept any attempts he might make to prolong disputes, drain resources, or retake control through loopholes or posthumous claims. The legal fortress was unbreachable, a maze of protections designed not just for me, but for anyone standing in the path of abuse, manipulation, and neglect. It was a model born from brutal experience, a blueprint painstakingly drawn in courtrooms and forged in late nights of research and strategy. Socially, the tides had turned. The community that once whispered doubts now rallied quietly in support. El's reputation lay in ruins, replaced by stories of his downfall and my mother's courage. Sympathy, respect, sometimes even admiration crossed the threshold of our rebuilt home, replacing the isolation that had once threatened to consume us. Emotionally, I could finally exhale. The fortress wasn't merely bricks and legal edicts, it was a sanctuary of peace I'd fought tooth and nail to claim. Every corner held meaning, every step echoed resilience. Yet beneath the calm, I remained vigilant. The battle scars ran deep, and the legal world is a minefield where past enemies sometimes seek to reemerge. I worked with my attorney to prepare for any future attempts by El to reopen claims or disputes should he ever return. Preemptive legal measures made it clear. Any such moves would be met with swift, crushing rebuttals designed to render them futile. Collateral seizure strategies were drafted, ensuring that if El were to die outside the country, his estate would be subject to restrictions, preventing any financial harm from reaching me or my mother's legacy. I was building walls not just for today, but for all tomorrows. The toll was heavy. PTSD and the memories of those years of relentless battle lingered like ghosts in quiet moments. But with every passing day, strength hardened beneath the surface, an unbreakable resolve born from survival and justice. Standing in the restored foyer, light spilling through clear windows onto polished floors, I felt the weight of what had been lost, balanced by the pride in what had been reclaimed. The house was no longer a prison or battlefield. It was a fortress of justice, a testament to survival, and a haven of hope. I had turned pain into power, chaos into control, and loss into legacy. The fortress stood firm, and within its walls I was no longer a victim, I was victor. The moment the final rulings solidified my ownership of the house and estate, I knew the battle was far from over. El's disappearance didn't mean the war had ended. It simply meant my next moves had to be sharper, more strategic. The legal trap was closing around him, designed not just to cut off his influence, but to crush any possibility of his return or interference. Working closely with my attorney, we crafted a web of preemptive measures, a complex matrix of agreements, liens, and restrictions that would make any attempt by Elle to reopen claims or disputes a dead end. Our signature weapon was a series of irrevocable trusts and contractual clauses embedded deep within the estate's legal framework. We made sure that the assets tied to the home, including the increased equity from renovations I financed, could never be untangled or leveraged by him again. There was no margin for error. Each clause was carefully worded, sealed by multiple layers of legal review, and designed to withstand any contestation. Elle's stubborn refusal to accept the court's decisions meant we had to anticipate every trick, every ploy his lawyers might try to drag us back into court for years more of draining litigation. We also prepared a collateral seizure strategy targeting any assets held under his name or through offshore accounts. Knowing well that he might have funneled property or money to evade sanctions, we set up mechanisms ensuring that if he died abroad, or even tried to trade assets covertly, they would be legally frozen and their value redirected to cover the debts and damages he owed. It was a painstaking, meticulous process that required exhaustive research and a network of international legal contacts. Day after day, we unearthed hidden shell companies, traced suspicious transfers, and coordinated with global authorities to tighten the chokehold on his remaining wealth. Beyond the financial fortress, we were also building an impenetrable shield against future harassment. Protective orders were extended, stricter than ever, covering not just me but my immediate circle, friends, legal advisors, even the contractors working on the house. Every potential angle for Elle to send threats or exert pressure vanished beneath the weight of formal legal prohibition. But the real fight was psychological. The knowledge that he was effectively locked out, stripped of control, yet still somewhere out there, fed a quiet tension beneath every victory. I knew firsthand how some opponents refused to accept defeat, how bitterness could twist into cruelty even from afar. So, I invested in my own resilience. Alongside legal battles, I worked with therapists specialized in trauma and PTSD, learning tools to manage the crushing weight of years of abuse and fight. I learned to read the signs, not just external but internal, of when the past threatened to pull me under. The legal community itself became a source of unexpected empowerment. My attorney, a fierce advocate steeped in family and criminal law, became a strategic ally who taught me to wield the law like a weapon. Together, we tracked every deadline, filed every claim, and countered every motion with precision and unyielding focus. As months passed, word leaked out about the extent of our legal fortress. Former neighbors, mutual acquaintances, and even his past business partners learned of Elle's unraveling empire, from blocked assets to sealed accounts and crushing debts. His social standing and financial power eroded under the relentless pressure. His attempts to stir the courts again were met not just with procedural rejection, but with counter-litigation for vexatious claims, lawsuits aimed at punishing frivolous legal abuse. We shifted from defense to offense, turning his own tactics against him. The house itself stood as a symbol of all that was won and protected. Each improvement I'd financed, the new windows safeguarding against break-ins, advanced security systems connected to law enforcement protocols, served as daily reminders that the fortress was real, physical, and fortified. Even so, I remained watchful. The knowledge that Elle might one day try to reemerge, through the courts or behind the scenes, meant I could never afford complacency. I prepared for a future where legal challenges may arise again, arming myself with contingencies, emergency motions already drafted and ready to deploy. The burden was immense. Legal battles that stretched into the night, emotional scars that flared unpredictably, the constant vigilance required to maintain what was reclaimed. But there was also clarity, a fierce satisfaction in knowing that the person who sought to dismantle our family had been contained. Through every negotiation and filing, the revenge took shape, not as blind rage, but as cold, calculated justice. It wasn't about destruction for its own sake. It was about building walls so high and so tight that no cruelty could penetrate. Each day, I walked through that house, surrounded by the fruits of endurance, layered in both loss and victory. Here was a life rebuilt deliberately, brick by legal brick. And in that fortress of justice, I stood unshaken, scarred, but unwavering, ready for whatever the next chapter might demand. The courtroom was silent, the kind of stillness that swallows every whispered hope and cough alike. My heart pounded beneath the thin fabric of my blouse, every breath measured, every glance sharpened with anticipation. This was no ordinary hearing. This was the moment when everything, every brutal fight, every sleepless night, every ounce of exhaustion would be distilled into judgment. The judge entered, her gaze steady, commanding attention without uttering a word. She carried the weight of 1,000 battles herself, but here, in this room, she held the power to redefine the course of my life, and the reckoning was coming. As the proceedings began, new evidence was laid bare, fresh yet undeniable. Files meticulously compiled, medical reports, video footage, personal testimonies, all converged to tell a complicated but clear story of abuse, neglect, and sabotage that had shadowed my mother's final years. Each piece was a strike against L's defenses, a revelation that pried open the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The judge's expression darkened as she absorbed the documented details of his hospital outburst, a moment frozen in time that had once been dismissed as unsubstantiated, but now stood as infallible proof. The courtroom murmured with the weight of that revelation. Here was a man who had deliberately obstructed life-saving treatment. Here was an abuser hiding behind cold justification. Legal counsel on both sides took their turns, but L's defense was crumbling. He was no longer the untouchable figure who laughed at warnings. Now, he was a shadow fighting against mounting evidence that eroded his credibility and control. As the hearing progressed, the judge's questions cut sharply into L's evasions, exposing inconsistencies and outright falsehoods. The courtroom witnessed not just a legal demolition, but a moral unmasking. The man who had tormented us was stripped bare, his brutality acknowledged in words that echoed beyond legalese. When the judge finally delivered her verdict, it was more than a legal ruling. It was an affirmation. Despite the absence of definitive criminal prosecution, an arena complicated by legal limits and evidentiary hurdles, the recognition was unmistakable. L's abuse had directly contributed to my mother's suffering and death. The court's words carried weight that silenced any lingering doubt. The judgment ordered extended protections, restated restrictions, and cemented my family's rights not only to property and assets, but to dignity and peace. It was a beacon of validation amid years of pain. Outside the courtroom, that verdict rippled through my community. Supportive voices grew louder, and the shadows that had once cloaked L's actions dissipated. His isolation became complete, not just legally but socially and morally. Yet, amid the victory was a subtle grief. Justice was not absolute. Criminal accountability remained a distant hope, tangled in complexities beyond personal will. But the quiet reckoning within that courtroom was a turning point, a moment where truth was acknowledged and boundaries redrawn. In the weeks that followed, I channeled that mixed surge of relief and resolve into advocacy. This wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about shining a light on hidden abuses within families facing terminal illness, about challenging a system that had allowed silence to flourish for too long. I spoke softly at first, small forums, survivor groups, sharing our story with a purpose beyond revenge. It was about preventing others from suffering in silence. The echoes of those conversations grew, sparking conversations otherwise buried beneath stigma and fear. My legal team and I also began working to influence policy, pushing for stronger protections, better oversight of abusive dynamics in families dealing with serious illness, and clearer pathways to justice. It was an uphill battle, but one I embraced fiercely. Physically, the house stood as a testament to that reckoning, restored, secure, and alive with memories honored rather than haunted. Standing there, I felt the full weight of what had been lost and what had been fiercely reclaimed. The scars, emotional, social, legal, would endure, a reminder of the battles fought and those still to come. But beneath the steady layers of strength was a profound peace, born not of forgetting but of confronting, of naming, and of refusing to be silenced. In this quiet reckoning, I stood firm, scarred but unyielding, a testament to survival, justice, and the relentless pursuit of truth amid darkness. The day I signed the final papers transferring full ownership of the house into my name, a heavy silence settled around me, not the silence of surrender, but the quiet roar of victory tinged with loss. The home that had witnessed years of torment, defiance, and relentless warfare now stood reclaimed, its walls a testament to survival and strength. Every corner held memories, some bruised and battered, others fiercely triumphant, and now it belonged solely to me. I walked through each room slowly, fingertips trailing over fresh paint and polished wood, feeling the pulse of resilience vibrating beneath the surface. This was my mother's legacy, our legacy, the fortress she had fought to protect even in her final breath, now entrusted to my hands. The weight wasn't just in the keys I held, but in the responsibility to honor what she endured and to build something new from the ashes. The legal battles might have forced El out, stripped him of his claims, and shackled his resources, but the true victory was deeper, etched into every choice I made moving forward. The ruthless, cold calculations he'd wielded so destructively became tools I now mastered to safeguard what remained of my family's dignity and future. Beyond the courtroom, I poured my efforts into rebuilding our lives, both tangible and intangible. Restoring the house was a labor of love and defiance. Each renovation wasn't mere decoration. It was a bold statement that the past would not dictate the future. Security systems, reinforced locks, structural repairs, every improvement was a barrier against the memories of fear and a foundation for hope. Financial independence, once a fragile dream shadowed by El's manipulation, was now a hard-earned reality. I managed our resources with the same vigilance that had once been necessary to defend them. Budgets balanced, unexpected expenses anticipated, and investments made not just to survive but to thrive. Each measured decision was a shield against potential sabotage and a brick in the fortress of autonomy. Socially, the fractures caused by years of abuse began to heal slowly but surely. Trust, once eroded by fear and lies, was rebuilt with care and consistency. Friends who had drifted away for their own reasons found their way back, and new alliances blossomed. People who admired resilience over silence and strength over surrender. Together, we formed a network that was as much a part of my defense as the legal protections or the fortified doors. In these moments of rebuilding, I also confronted the scars etched deep within, psychological wounds that lingered beyond legal victories and financial stability. PTSD was a quiet, unyielding shadow that sometimes wrapped around me in the darkest hours. Nightmares, sudden flare-ups of pain, and the constant undercurrent of hypervigilance were battles fought behind closed doors. But I faced them with the same fierce resolve, seeking therapy and support, refusing to let trauma dictate my future. My mother's memory was both a balm and a burden. I honored her with every step forward, carrying her lessons of strength and endurance. Her courage, even in the face of overwhelming darkness, became a beacon guiding me through uncertainty and fear. Yet, the fight for justice did not end with ownership or restoration. Using the knowledge and experience I gained, I channeled my pain into advocacy, speaking out to raise awareness about family abuse hidden behind closed doors, especially when compounded by serious illness. I joined forces with organizations committed to supporting survivors, pushing for legal reforms that would close the gaps exploited by manipulators like El. The journey was, and remains, arduous. Every legal amendment proposed, every support program expanded, felt like a step toward preventing others from enduring what my mother and I suffered. It was revenge of the most profound kind, not destruction, but transformation, not retribution alone, but redemption. Financially, I continued to navigate the treacherous aftermath. El's remaining debts, estate claims, and sporadic legal stunts required constant vigilance. But with a fortified legal team and a deep understanding of our system's intricacies, I stayed several moves ahead. The fortress around our future stood firm, its walls reinforced by every document filed, every counterclaim launched, and every penny recovered. At times, the shadows of bitterness threatened to creep back in. But I met them not with rage, but with unyielding resolve. The resolve to be the author of my story, to define my legacy not by the cruelty inflicted upon us, but by the strength we summoned to rise above it. Standing now in the sunlit living room, surrounded by the echoes of past battles and the promise of new beginnings, I feel a profound sense of purpose. This home is more than property. It is a monument to survival, a sanctuary for healing, and a beacon for those who dare to fight back. The journey forged a new me, scarred but unbroken, cautious yet hopeful, vigilant but never defeated. My mother's legacy is not just a memory encased in bricks and mortar, but a living testament to resilience and justice. I am ready to defend this legacy, to nurture it, and to ensure that the strength born from pain continues to shine, even when shadows threaten to return. This is my fortress, my family's future, and no force can tear it down.